Good morning, everyone. I'm Leanne Griffin, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Strengths-Based Assessment and Person-Centered Treatment Planning According to Recovery-Oriented Systems of Care. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Before we get started, let's go over a couple of technical details. Note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your own name. Throughout the presentation today, as you have questions and comments, you may use the chat panel of the WebEx platform to send those comments and questions to the presenter and to myself. I'm the host throughout the presentation today. Our audio today is being broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options have also been posted in the chat panel, so that may be helpful for you. If you continue to experience a loss of audio or poor audio through your computer speakers, you can always try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio portion of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 5 business days. Also, a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to participants within 5 business days. Approximately 1 to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and also for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. At the event's conclusion, the web browser will direct participants to an evaluation form on the FADA website. If you would like to receive continuing education credits or a certificate of attendance for this event, you must complete the evaluation. Please be sure to include any Florida license number as applicable for reporting to CE Broker, along with the prefix for your license number. Your certificate of attendance will be delivered to your email address within 5 business days. Do note, please, also that WebEx monitors arrival and departure of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. This attendance log and the evaluation forms are used to validate the provision of contact hours or the certificates of attendance. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar. We are not permitted to provide partial credit. I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's webinar. Janis Tondora, Psy.D, is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Yale University School of Medicine. Her professional interests focus on the design, implementation, and evaluation of services providing self-determination, recovery, and community inclusion among individuals living with serious behavioral health disorders. A steering committee member of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's National Consensus Building Initiative on Person-Centered Care, Dr. Tondora has provided training and consultation to nearly 20 states seeking to develop person-centered planning models. Co-author of a practical guide to recovery-oriented practice, Tools for Transforming Mental Health Care, she wrote Partnering for Recovery in Mental Health, a practical guide to person-centered planning. Dr. Tondora received her BA in psychobiology at Yale University and her PSYD in clinical psychology at the University of Hartford. We're very pleased to have Dr. Janis Tondora join us today. And Janis, if you're ready, I'm going to hand over control of the presentation to you.
Absolutely, I can take it away from here. Thanks, Leanne, for the introduction. Happy Friday, everyone. I may be a familiar voice to some of you if you joined us a few weeks ago. I did an initial webinar about recovery-oriented language called Words Matter, and we had some great participation on that. It was quite a lively bunch, so we're hoping for a similar experience today. And the topics that we're going to tackle today really build nicely off of what I presented a couple of weeks ago. So let me just say a couple of additional things by way of background and introduction. So Leanne did mention that I am on the faculty at the Department of Psychiatry. I'm at a place called the Program for Recovery and Community Health, which is pretty unique because it's actually a public academic partnership with the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And what's unique about that is that it really allows me to spend the vast majority of my time out in the field alongside clinical practitioners, administrators, who are really struggling and working hard at trying to take broad recovery-based concepts and actually implement them according to practice guidelines in a variety of different contexts and across levels of care and so forth. So by no means, I always tell folks, I do not sit up at Yale in an ivory tower doing research on my computer. I spend most of my time, could be state hospitals, homeless shelters, community mental health centers, doing some outreach and engagement. And so my hope is that that experience is going to really help me to keep it real, you know, for you all today, and to give you some practical tips and tools around this topic and practice of strengths-based assessment and person-centered planning. And the last thing that I'll just say by way of introduction is that I think just to acknowledge that sometimes recovery-oriented trainings or educational webinars like this, they can come across negative in the sense that people sometimes get the message that they're being told that all that they're doing in day-to-day practice is wrong. And there's a lot of focus on the things that are not recovery-oriented and all the things that need to be fixed and so forth. And as a teacher and as a consultant, I really think a lot about parallel process. And if I'm on a webinar today asking all of you to be strengths-based and think about what that means in supporting folks you serve, then I want to take a strengths-based approach in having this conversation. So yes, I think that we have a ways to go and there's lots of improvements that we can make, but I spend enough time out in the field to know that there's beautiful person-centered work, you know, happening out there all day, every day. So this webinar is really just meant to kind of both build off of those strengths that you already have, but also give you lots of practical advice for how you can maybe take it to the next level. So what I'm going to do here is, let me start by telling you what we hope to achieve in the time we have together here. So I'd like you all to leave, if you don't already have this, with a clear understanding of how person-centered care might differ from more traditional models in behavioral health service delivery. But we're going to go past the abstract and philosophical and really focus on identifying concrete practical strategies, both in person-centered assessment and in person-centered recovery planning. And then finally, I'm hoping you all will learn some strategies to really maintain the rigor of your clinical documentation that we recognize is necessary in order to meet various fiscal and accreditation standards. Oftentimes when I do this kind of training, the way you can really boil it down is that people are often struggling with how do I co-create a plan that both honors the person and it still satisfies the chart. And it satisfies my supervisor, and it satisfies the folks in billing and compliance. And lots of people think that those worlds are incompatible, person-centered, recovery-focused. and then the medical necessity world. And it's really my hope that walking out of this webinar, that you all will see how they can come together in one quality plan. So throughout today's presentation, I try my best, even in a webinar platform, to build in some interactivity, and this is an example of where we want to do that. So I'm going to ask you all to just kind of engage in an opening exercise, and that's going to really help me get a better sense of kind of what's on your mind as it relates to this. How do you think about person-centered recovery planning? What have you heard? And I'm going to ask you to use a chat box, please, to respond to this. So just imagine for a moment, kind of off the top of your head, you're out last night with friends, you tell them you gotta head home because you've got a webinar tomorrow on person-centered planning, and they say to you, well, that sounds kind of interesting, so what exactly is person-centered planning? And what I just ask you all to do for about 2 minutes, if you could just using that chat box, just type in a few phrases or a brief sentence about how you would define person-centered planning. What is it and how is it different? So go ahead and do that, and then I'll do a little bit of reflection on your responses. Don't be shy. We've got a couple of responses coming in. How do you think it's different? I'll reflect some of these back as they're coming in. You know, we're talking much more about, you know, how do we really sort of fit the person's goals and their strengths, and also alongside weaknesses or challenges, if you will, into the treatment. So we're looking for a balance between those things, really trying to make sure that our planning is based on the person's needs and their desires. Other ways in which it might be different. Any other responses out there? Yeah, so much more person-driven about what the person, what's important, you know, to the person, rather than maybe what we think only is important as the professionals. So what's important to them, and not just what we think might be important for them. Lots more focus on the strengths, and there's a nice response here about, you know, providing services with people, not just to them. You know, absolutely, we're going to talk a lot about what does that partnership look like and how does it play out in practice. Okay, great. Let me go ahead. Feel free to continue to use the chat box. I do try as best I can, even during my remarks, to monitor that, and I may stop and pause and respond to something. But let me go on ahead and talk just a little bit about the context within which this work is happening, and why I think that webinars like this are a valuable investment of your time. Because really, when you think about strengths-based person-centered assessment, person-centered planning, you know, I often say that the train has not only arrived, but it has left the station. So this webinar is really an opportunity for you to get some tips and tools to hopefully help you on that journey. So what are some of the specific forces behind person-centered care? You know, obviously, this is very much a values-driven approach, just recognizing that it's the right thing to do. I often refer back to the golden rule and just, you know, ask people, if your loved one is in distress, if you're feeling vulnerable, if you have to present for services at a behavioral health agency, how do you want to be treated when you walk through the front door? What do you want folks to ask you about? What's going to make you feel more comfortable? And then their responses, you know, around that really should be your guidepost. Just think about what it is that you would expect out of quality person or patient-centered care. And then, of course, there's a wide range of forces behind this approach. Certainly within the state of Florida, I've been getting familiar myself with some of your, very impressive statewide recovery-oriented systems of care initiatives. And that is also a reflection of a consistent theme at the federal and national level, where you see person-centered assessment, person-centered care and planning reflected in everything from the new Freedom Commission way back when to different treatment standards that are coming out. It's even increasingly, you're seeing this being required by funders, including the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. A lot of folks are often surprised to hear that, and I share that a lot of my work through the years has actually been funded. We had a long 5-year state demonstration grant that was funded by CMS that was specifically about helping the state of Connecticut to really think through in practice what a more person-centered approach to planning might look like. So increasingly, both funders and accrediting bodies, whether you're talking about CARF accreditation, Joint Commission, and so forth, they not only allow person-centered care, they not only encourage it, they're increasingly requiring it. And of course, we have accumulating evidence and data. Some of that data we've been generating here at Yale. It's been coming out of some really nice pockets of best practice around the country, but the evidence and the data is really growing that shows that if we really concretize in practice what it means to be person-centered, that we get better outcomes for people that we're serving. So I like to really think of this as a perfect storm, if you will, that the forces are aligning behind this, which is why it's really not the flavor of the month, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So hopefully this webinar is going to give you tips and tools to feel more comfortable with the practice. But most importantly, lest we not forget the most critical voice behind all of this, which is really the voice of people receiving services, who increasingly are being very vocal about what they expect and deserve out of quality care and the quality care plan. So these are just a couple of my favorite quotes from projects that we've worked on through the years. Someone who says, when I have a voice in my own plan, I feel a responsibility to work it, in my recovery. So somebody really talking about the fact that for many years they felt like they did not have ownership over their plan of care, and for that reason were not necessarily taking advantage of what was in it. And when they're really involved as a partner, that sense of investment and actually using it as a concrete tool to move forward can really be enhanced. I don't want to leave out, of course, just some references to the really great work that I'm learning is happening in Florida in your different transformation initiatives. And, specific to this idea of person-centered assessment and person-centered planning, in the initial study of recovery services in Florida, there was an acknowledgement that there has been progress, certainly, but also the fact that individuals did not necessarily experience program activities as being relevant to those most valued life recovery goals, and that treatment planning could sometimes feel like a bureaucratic rather than that kind of interpersonal therapeutic process that it is intended to be, and that while Florida has a range of pockets of these very highly innovative recovery-oriented services, that there didn't appear to be a framework that was really kind of weaving it all together. I would actually suggest that one framework you all might consider is the framework of the person-centered recovery plan. But that's often a place where you can reflect, the very best of your innovative recovery-oriented services in the context of a plan itself, whether that's the integration of quality peer specialist services, psychiatric advanced directives, very innovative recovery-oriented rehabilitative and clinical services. So that just might be something to think about. And then the context of some of the assessment that's been going on in Florida, I've been very interested. I've been learning about the tool that James Winarski developed the SAP tool, the self-assessment planning tool that gathered some data on sort of the status of recovery-oriented practices in Florida. And within that tool, there were a couple of domains that were particularly relevant, I think, to the topics today of strengths-based assessment and person-centered recovery planning, including both the treatment domain, the sections of which you see illustrated up here on the slide, and then also the community integration domain that, talked much more about access and pathways to community life and basic, life resources and, making sure that folks are not having their plans be limited only to a focus on clinical stability, if you will, but they're really about thriving, in a community of their choice. So if the feds are on board and the state's pushing it and accreditors are supporting it and people in recovery are demanding it, so there's all this consensus that it's a good thing, then why isn't it universally implemented in practice? This is a big question that always comes up. And what I've done on the next couple of slides is I've just woven in some of the common reservations, concerns, source of resistance that we might see in the field. Some of these might resonate with those of you on the line. For others of you, these things may not be a concern, but perhaps colleagues back at the ranch, back at your agency, or people that you supervise are struggling. And you can see that these concerns that might stand in the way of your implementation, they might range from the more kind of philosophical or attitudinal. So questions come up around, well, people are not motivated to do this, or maybe they're disinterested in some way. Or a big question that often comes up is, if people are given more choice in their recovery, what do we do if people make, quote, bad choices? And so we're going to have an opportunity at the end to come back to these and hopefully have some good discussion around them and really some alternative ways of thinking about and working around these areas of confusion. But I also did want to point out to you all at the end in the references pages, we've actually wrote a paper a few years ago on this topic called The Top 10 Concerns and Person-Centered Care. And we kind of go through sort of step-by-step different ways to think about these things so that you actually can move forward, in your implementation. Again, some of these are practical. It could be lack of time, caseloads are too high. We certainly recognize razor-thin margins, very under-resourced systems out there. We talk a lot about the fact that, many times it is not necessarily about doing more, it's about doing differently together with people. But we're sensitive to the fact, of course, that many of you out there, you're struggling with what I call initiative fatigue. We have gone into agencies, out west and walked in, and I've had people say to me, please tell me that you don't have another fidelity scale that we have to be tracking, right? Because you're continuously bombarded with, different initiatives and so forth. And so we recognize that you may have this initiative fatigue. So again, as we kind of walk through the practices, know that we're sensitive to that. And no matter what kind of time that you're working with, we really think that there are sometimes even some simple strategies that you can use that can really enhance the person-centered nature of the care and the planning that you're providing. And then this last one, I just want to highlight a bit because it's a pretty classic response that we get in the field. Of course, we put folks first and we listen to what's important to them. Don't we already do it? And is person-centered assessment and planning, is it really any different? So what I would say in response to that, I've traveled around the country a lot doing this work, and I've seen a lot of beautiful person-centered practice in action. But like I had said in my introduction, if you really take a closer look at the details and you talk to people about their experience and services, and we take stock of our current practices, how we do team meetings, how we actually write that written recovery plan, we've come a long way, but we still have a ways to go. Please don't be squinting trying to read the microscopic font that is on this page. You'll see that I've referenced the website, and again, that's going to be included at the reference page. So this is a resource, kind of a take-home resource that you can access after the webinar. This was our best attempt to really concretize, if you're adhering to person-centered philosophy, how might that look different in a treatment planning meeting and in the treatment plan document itself? It addresses both process and documentation. And it's called the Person-Centered Care Questionnaire, and we have versions of this tool for people receiving services, for people providing services, for administrators, and for family members, because we think the perspective of all those stakeholders in this change process is really critical. So do we already provide person-centered planning? Let's start with an example, because not necessarily. I want to tell you about someone that I will call Mr. Gonzalez. And this came out of a real consultation that we did in a CMHC. It's been mixed up for some Florida-specific relevance here. But a team basically had kind of called me up, and they had said, we've got this fellow we're supporting, and we think he's got a lot of potential, but, you know, he's completely uncooperative, he's non-compliant with his meds, he's refusing to talk to the doctor, and he won't get with the program, right? And we don't know where to start with him. And how on earth are we going to actually write a person-centered plan for him is what they were saying to me. So what I had said to them was that I don't have a magic wand in my back pocket, but tell me a little bit about the story. I need to know about the story before I come down there, spend some time with the team and with Mr. Gonzalez. And this is the story they told me that you see on the next couple of screens here. He's a young 31-year-old married Puerto Rican man, proud father to 2 boys, recently relocated to Florida with his family perhaps after they were displaced in a natural disaster. They were forced to evacuate when their home was left uninhabitable. Mr. Gonzalez is diagnosed with bipolar disorder, has a co-occurring addiction to alcohol, which he may rely on to manage distressing symptoms. He's been experiencing an increase in acute psychiatric symptoms since his relocation, and during a recent period of acute mania, he was having increasingly volatile arguments with his wife in the presence of his young children. And on one occasion, he shoved his wife to the floor, which prompted her to call the police. And then when the police arrived at the home, he was uncooperative, he was upset, and he was subsequently admitted to an inpatient hospitalization and then later discharged to a community mental health center. So Mrs. Gonzalez was open to reconciliation. She continued to be actively involved in his treatment. However, she asked him to leave the family home and said she would not allow him to see her or his boys until he, quote, gets things under control. Mr. Gonzalez stated that his love for his family and his faith in God keep him going in difficult times. He was feeling very misunderstood by his treatment team, but he had developed a positive connection with a peer recovery coach at the agency. So they're basically asking me for my support and helping them to engage him and develop a person-centered plan. But I had said to them, first, I want to see the working treatment plan that you developed with this gentleman that you have described as non-compliant, disengaged, and so forth. And so this was basically the plan that they sent me. Achieve and maintain clinical stability, reduce your assaultive behavior, comply with the meds. Show up at our groups, talk to the doctor, recognize the role of substances, so on and so forth. Okay, think about that for a moment. As I look at this plan, it was no wonder to me why Mr. Gonzalez was, quote, disengaged, okay? If I were Mr. Gonzalez, I'd be feeling a lot like this. I'm here to return your goals because you left them on my recovery plan, right? My goals in life are not to take my lithium and increase my insight, reduce my assaults, and so on and so forth. There was nothing in that plan that really respected Mr. Gonzalez as a unique human being. That plan, in fact, could have just as easily been for Mr. Martino or Mr. Smith. So it didn't happen overnight. But I remember we went down to do this consultation, and clear as day, it will stay with me forever. Mr. Gonzalez came into the room, and this is a proud Latino father, comes into the room and just breaks down in tears. He was so remorseful about what had happened in front of the boys. And he just said, I want to get my family back. I don't want my boys to ever be afraid of me again. So this was really his driving motivation in his life. And this is what we want the plan to start with, that life goal that's most important to him. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have significant barriers or mental health or addictions-related impairments that are getting in the way. In fact, he did. He had acute symptoms of mania that led to violence in the home. He had a lack of coping strategies to manage distress. And in the absence of those, he would tend to use alcohol, which would further kind of increase the potential for violence or behavioral issues and so forth. So for those of you that are kind of sitting on the line wondering about that golden thread of medical necessity, how am I going to get these plans paid for and reimbursed? If that's a concern that you have, hopefully you will see that your medical necessity and the rigorous documentation of your behavioral health barriers continues to be documented in the person-centered plan. It's just they don't become the sole and dominant focus, right? They're documented insofar as they get in the way of what's most important to Mr. Gonzalez, in this case, getting his family back. He also had a range of strengths to draw upon, and here we are integrating them into the recovery plan, as many of you noted in our quick opening exercise. Very devoted dad, highly motivated for change. His wife continued to be supportive, despite the fact that she was making some pretty significant requests of him and had some demands and expectations. He was devoutly Catholic. Faith and prayer had been a source of comfort for him. And he did have that positive connection to a peer specialist. So just to give you one quick sample of a short-term objective that was ultimately kind of negotiated amongst the team after lots of discussion with Mr. Gonzalez, he talked about, could he apply some new coping strategies to have positive interactions with his wife and kids during one supervised visit and family therapy session within 30 days, okay? So in this objective, what Mr. Gonzalez sees is that his team hears him and that his team is invested in helping him take that step in the right direction toward getting back with his family. And now, of course, he's going to need a range of different supports to be able to do that successfully. In fact, maybe he needs some good med management to reduce some of the irritability or that acute mania that had contributed to difficulties. Maybe they need some family therapy sessions to work on expectations and reunification, or some rehabilitative coping skills training, more about teaching and coaching, conflict resolution, communication skills that foster successful visits. You could have a certified drug and alcohol counselor doing lots of great stuff, really, again, trying to reduce that reliance on alcohol, which only tended to make things worse for him. And then last but not least, we wanted to tap into some of those more natural strengths and connections. And so the peer specialist was going to work with him to develop a wellness recovery action plan so that in the absence of drinking, he would have simple, safe, effective things that he could do on his own every day to maintain his wellness. And one of those might include maybe some local spiritual direction from someone within his faith community as a positive coping strategy. So what I'm hoping you see in starting with this example is that you can weave together a plan that starts with that goal that is most important to the person, whether that's get my family back, get a girlfriend, volunteer at the library, take a trip to see my grandkids. But you can do that and you can continue to integrate into that plan really rigorous attention to the behavioral health issues that are getting in the way. So what I'm going to do here for a moment, I'd like to start with that example just to hopefully a couple of things. A, grab your attention around the fact that this could actually really look different in practice because this may be a different method of documenting for you all. I'm going to walk through that all in detail as we go through the webinar today. And also just to put your minds at ease, if we have quality management folks on the line, just to reinforce this notion that there's nothing about this model of person-centered recovery planning that really should compromise the necessary rigor in your clinical documentation. In fact, I would say the vast majority, if not all, of the states that I have worked with in this kind of work pretty universally say that it puts them in a better position to satisfy things around their audits and their site visits and so forth, right? So let's take a step back for a minute and talk big picture here, though, because I am a firm believer. I know that everyone on the line, people say, just tell me how to write the darn plan. They're so hard. And so I know that it's easy to get focused on the plan given the pressures that you're under. I'm a very firm believer that what it means to be person-centered has to start long before you get to the plan itself, whether it's written or electronic. So first and foremost, it has to be rooted in a philosophy of recovery, right? Believing that people can and do recover, they can and should make decisions that impact their lives and their treatment. That should then lead to maybe some new kinds of processes, new ways of partnering, before meetings, during meetings, after meetings, and so forth. And that meeting should generate what hopefully looks like an enhanced plan, maybe a different kind of a plan with much more of that focus on those quality life role goals, which brings us to our final P of purpose. And just always remembering that person-centered planning is about helping people to not just survive their illness and manage symptoms or addiction. It's about helping people thrive, moving past surviving, helping them thrive in a community of their choice, and looking at all sorts of quality of life outcomes. So for those of you that may be interested in more detail about this model, I just want to point out again, this will be in the reference pages at the end. This slide comes from a really nice 7.5-minute video that our team at Yale produced with some partners across the pond, as they say. And it really kind of walks through each of these sort of essential Ps of person-centered recovery planning, and we've had a pretty good response to it, folks using it in in-service training, staff meetings, just to generate kind of conversation about these things, get a sense of where you're doing well, or maybe really where you need to dedicate some attention. So in today's webinar, I'm going to be focusing largely on those middle two Ps of process and of the plan and the documentation, specifically as it relates to person-centered assessment and planning, partly because other webinars within this series, I think, focus more heavily on the overall philosophical foundation and also on the outcomes or the product. So just some key processes to point out here. You know, obviously we want people to be a partner in all planning activities or meetings, you know, that are about their care. This means that they should really have some advance notice. We have a peer specialist here at Yale that talks about, you know, we got to kind of get past these pop-up meetings, you know, and this happens sometimes, not because we're not well-intended, but, you know, you log onto your computer in the morning, your electronic health record, all sorts of alarms start going off, and Joe's treatment plan is overdue, and if you don't get it in the chart in the next 72 hours, you can't bill for services. Right, and so then a little later in the day, you happen to be walking around by the cafeteria and you happen to spot Joe, and, you know, maybe you had a cancellation and you've got some time between meetings. You say, Joe, you know, come on in. I had a cancellation. We got 20 minutes. You know, tell me all about your hopes, dreams, and desires and how we're going to get there. Ready, set, go. Okay? And obviously I'm exaggerating that, you know, a bit to make a point, but it's just, I think, an example of how sort of these external pressures really interface with our work on a day-to-day basis, that people really don't get advance notice and they don't always feel like a partner. So some other ways of helping them to feel like a true partner is make sure they have some reasonable control over logistics. You know, when the planning conversation happens, who's invited, do we offer them a written copy of the plan? Actually take a copy of the plan, put it in their hands and say, this is what I think I hear you saying. Did we get it right together? And if not, having commitment to go back and revise, edit accordingly. And You know, I highlight this point a lot. Most places nowadays are making it sort of a standard expectation in care that people get a written copy. And I like to emphasize it partly because, you know, I understand that the treatment plan is often seen really as a bureaucratic document, that we really do it for the chart, right? And oftentimes we don't see it as having a meaningful connection to the work we do on a day-to-day basis. In fact, most of us feel like it gets in the way of the work because it takes so darn long, okay? But I'm hoping what you're going to see by the end of the webinar that the co-creation of a truly person-centered plan, the way that we're talking about, it's not just paperwork. It is the work of recovery that you're doing together, okay? And the plan is a manifestation of a partnership, and what kind of message does it send if we don't automatically offer a copy? So just a couple of words on perhaps how the structure and roles and planning meetings might shift a little bit, including how you might educate and prepare people in recovery to partner with you on this process. So let me just give you a little bit of detail on a few more of these kind of key processes and practices. We understand that based on a person's preferences, that oftentimes your planning conversations may be more of a one-on-one conversation, but in person-centered recovery planning, you know, we encourage the expansion of the team to include a broader range of providers as well as natural supporters. It could be friends, family, representatives from faith or cultural communities, et cetera. So in this case, if you find yourself doing some more team-based planning, just a couple of quick tips and reminders. This list actually came out of some work we did with a state hospital that was taking a really hard look at how they were doing treatment planning. They were under a Department of Justice investigation. They had a corrective action plan in place. And to their credit, they were very thoughtful about self-reflecting on what their meetings looked like. And so they came up with basically a treatment team best practices, if you will, to really make sure that the person felt like the planning conversation was sacred space. So even things like spatial setup of the room, making sure the person's not at the head of a long table with 10 people all, you know, sitting around the table feeling like it's the Grand Inquisition and so forth. You know, if they have a really trusted provider on the team or a family member, you know, making sure they sit beside the person, sitting in a circle, whatever you have to do, little things like that can make a difference. Just like arriving on time, not moving in and out. This is a classic issue that we encounter because of the pressures in hospital settings. If you happen to have any hospital-based providers on the line, right, you're sitting in a planning conversation with a person and maybe their family, got all sorts of codes going off, so you got key members of the team running out, running in. We understand that you may have little control over that, but I'm just asking people to pause for a minute and think about if this is supposed to be a sacred space where we're giving the person our full attention, what might that feel like, you know, for them? And then just a classic one that I will say, I am guilty as charged with this. When we think about all those little handheld electronic devices, they're both a blessing and a curse because it is very tempting when you're under so much pressure around your productivity. It's very tempting to be checking email, responding to quick texts, even catching up on paperwork or charting, and to just be conscious of that and try to catch each other. And again, I know how hard it is because I've been guilty as charged myself, but just be thinking about those planning times as really being kind of sacred space. And then I would just say, this is a really, really key point. I'm hoping that on the line out there, we have lots of peer specialists, hopefully lots of people in recovery. Very often when I do these webinars and training events, they're all for, quote, professional staff, you know, clinicians, doctors, social workers, and that's great. But if we're only educating professional staff about partnering and person-centered planning, you are only educating and preparing half of the partnership. You have to think about what are the needs of the person in recovery so they can feel comfortable and confident coming to the table, right? Some folks are naturals at that, right? They already feel comfortable being in the driver's seat, and we just got to move on over a little bit and be a co-pilot. They're already a great self-advocate. But for other people, especially if they've been treated in services for a long time and they're used to be treated like a passenger, that may not come easy to them. They may feel intimidated, scared, uncomfortable, and need some skills themselves. So what you're looking at here, this is another embedded resource for you all. It's called Getting in the Driver's Seat of Your Treatment. And this is actually a toolkit that we developed a number of years ago with people in recovery, for people in recovery, to help them get ready to assume whatever degree of partnership that they want to in person-centered recovery planning, okay? It's got lots of great embedded worksheets and exercises to help folks get ready. Some people receiving services can use the toolkit all on their own to kind of get organized. Other people may want a staff member to provide some support around it, but a tip that I will tell you, the place where we have seen person-centered planning get the most traction is when we get this kind of a toolkit into the hands of peer specialists, actually. I just got back from the state of Texas late last night where they're doing some fantastic work where they have teams of peer specialists doing kind of educational forums, monthly potlucks. They're walking through parts of this toolkit. They have some peers doing one-on-one office hours. If you have a person-centered treatment plan coming up in the next month, you know, schedule an appointment with me for an hour and we'll kind of walk through the toolkit together. So that's one way to think about how you can kind of capitalize on the talents of some of your local peer specialists. And just another quick tip about this, just trying to be practical here. People always say, this is stuff we would love to do, Janis, but we can't bill for it. And we're under so much pressure with our productivity. We had a program here in Connecticut that very legitimately, with full authorization, they were delivering the evidence-based curriculum of illness management and recovery. And within that curriculum, there's a module called Getting Your Needs Met in the mental health system. So within that module, they integrated aspects of this driver's seat toolkit as a way to promote person-centered planning, but they did it within the context of a reimbursable rehabilitative service. So I'm just trying to not only get the tools to you, but sort of give you some tips for how you might use them, okay? So a couple more key processes. Just to mention again, I've given some examples about the critical role that peer specialists can play in this process in a range of ways. Certainly person-centered planning, person-centered assessment looks for all sorts of strategies to support and respect people's right to self-determination. Now, of course, self-determination is going to look different across individuals, of course, based on what their own preferences might be, including cultural preferences, maybe some of their abilities or their experiences of mental health systems may impact that. But fundamentally, we have to think about self-determination as a right. And so that would include concretely, you know, when I'm reviewing recovery plans, and if it's a person who's been in and out of the hospital for the last couple of years, you know, when they're in the community and they're doing well, I really want to see that you're doing a psychiatric advanced directive with them. Or some kind of advanced crisis plan, like we would see in RAP planning, you know, because these are, I think, tools that really manifest self-determination in practice because they're a way to help people hang on to as much dignity and control at a time where perhaps because of an emergency clinical situation, some of that control may need to be temporarily taken away, hopefully only temporarily. So I was really pleased to see in going through some of the Florida ROSC efforts that you've got some great initiatives it looks like around things like psychiatric advanced directives. And then, of course, lots more focus on strengths-based approach in both language, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, as well as in assessment and planning. And the last thing I'll say on this slide that I think is really important is that, again, we throw around the term community inclusion. Yes, having a job, having a life in the community, going back to church, those things are important, but maybe they're what comes after the real work of clinical treatment. Okay, so let me say a few words about what I mean by that, because even the most well-intended systems I have worked with fall into this trap. There's this way of thinking about it in a really linear way, right, where a person struggling with some kind of behavioral health experience They enter into this box we call treatment. We offer this whole bunch of professional services. We try to get that wrapped up in a neat little bow. And then once they do, of course, we want them to go back on with their lives and get jobs and get dates and, you know, have hobbies and all that sort of thing. And what I would really challenge you all around is that even though it sounds outlandish, that has direct implications for treatment plans, because I still see treatment plans all across America that say things like, okay, the person's biggest goal in life is they want to get their job back. But then I hear the conversation, well, you're not ready. You know, until you've done 90 meetings in 90 days, you're not work ready. So the goal on the plan really needs to be about the abstinence, okay? So I was thrilled a couple of weeks ago to hear that supported employment is alive and well in Florida, and hopefully that is helping to overcome that linear way of thinking, right? Because, you know, the only thing that we know that really predicts success in the workplace is a consistent expressed desire to work, right? Rather than making people jump through all of these clinical hoops, if you will. Or folks who live in a group home who, before they die, the one thing they really want is a key to their own apartment, right? So the goal on the plan should be, I want to get my own independent apartment. But then the conversation devolves into, well, when you've been med compliant for 6 months, the team will feel more comfortable revisiting that. So what I'm trying to illustrate there is that even though we want to support people around these quality of life goals, sometimes we sort of slip into this linear way of thinking where we keep saying, not yet, wait, wait. And the really tragic thing is that wait for a lot of people has meant never. So this whole practice of person-centered planning, you know, is about recognizing you put the person in the middle and you go after the goal and then you wrap the services around them. And I'll give you lots of examples of what that looks like, but really just wanted to emphasize that things like having a job, having someone to love, having a faith connection, you know, they are not things that should have to be earned through clinical compliance or acts of compliance. They are fundamentally human rights that we really want to strive to support in our planning. So what I'm going to do here, Leanne, is going to take the controls, and I'm going to show you a little video that is both people in recovery and service providers talking about how different it really feels when systems are operating in a person-centered way. So they're going to talk about their journey through person-centered care and planning, both what it felt like before and after, and then I'll take some comments. If you want to expand the video, please click on the bottom right-hand corner of the button.
Thank you, Janice, and we'll get started in just 1 second.
Sure.
Treatment planning way back was not much of a treatment plan. It was more of me coming to the mental health center and expecting them to be able to fix me.
The treatment plan was essentially a number of prescribed treatments for problems. I really just wanted to be heard, and I wasn't. Something, feeling a part of something. I'm on the team. My treatment has changed since person-centered because now I am a part of the team, and so I'm involved with the planning of the dates. I'm given a
treatment planning involves the client a lot more. We actually have them sitting in the room with us to talk about
All right, folks, this is Janis. Bear with us because we think we had maybe some technical difficulties with that, but Leanne's going to give me control back, and I'll take it from there. Hopefully it was okay for a bunch of you. Apologies for that. We had this worked smoothly with our dry run, but sometimes technology doesn't always cooperate.
Thank you, Janis. You should have control back now.
Yeah, I do. So the good thing about that is I lost audio for a minute. It gave me a minute to catch up on some of the great comments coming into the chat box. Somebody was remarking, you know, about the fact that the more they've tried to work this way as in a partnership, they've found that what they had previously seen as resistant to treatment on the part of the individual has really decreased tremendously, that those power struggles are gone, that there's much more engagement, which it just fundamentally makes sense, right? Like if you're feel meaningfully involved as a partner, you're much more actively work that plan in your recovery. And there are questions coming in about difficulty writing the objectives. I'm going to segue quickly here now to make sure we talk a lot about documentation in the hour that we have left. And people making great comments about just like you would prepare someone ahead of time and maybe do some role playing, like if they had a court appearance and you wanted them to understand the process, how to make sure their rights are being respected, thinking about that analogy sort of in the same way of how we could help them be ready to be a partner in their recovery plan, okay? So let me go ahead and move on to the next big chunk here where we're going to talk much more about what the documentation looks like. I'm having a little bit of a delay in my slides, so just give me a quick second here. Okay, here we go. So despite our best intentions, I want to talk about what happens when you try to bring these 4 Ps of person-centered planning together. Sometimes we're very person-centered in our philosophy, or even very person-centered in the way we do conversations and meetings. But then what happens is the quality of the plan can break down moving from process to documentation, okay? So I often will consult with agencies in sort of 2 parts, and I'll go sit with a team and sit in on a planning meeting or a one-on-one planning conversation, and I'm just in awe of what's happening in the room, like clinician holding hope for the person when they've lost it for themselves, exploring an awesome range of territories around going back to church and school and having a cup of coffee with their neighbor, those kinds of things. And then the second part of that consultation, though, I go back like 2 weeks later and I say, okay, so show me the plan that you created that came out of that conversation, okay? And unfortunately, so often what happens is I go back and I pick up the plan and I have to say to the team, like, are you sure that this is Joe's plan? Because 2 weeks ago we were talking about, you know, Joe going to visit his mother at the nursing home and Joe getting back to church. And this here plan, all it says is med compliance and clinical stability. So what happened, okay? So let me tell you a part of what I think happened. You know, how can we create these plans that simultaneously honor the person and they include all of the technical rigor and the documentation requirements that they need to without creating plans that are so detailed that no one's going to want to use them. I'm going to create them in a way that balances sort of the spirit of what it means to be person-centered with the rigor required in your clinical documentation. because I imagine many of you on the line are kind of feeling like this, kind of caught between this rock and a hard place, right? So another way to think of it, this is one of, my all-time favorite quotes, a case manager up here in Connecticut talking about, I just feel like I'm trying to force a square peg into a round hole and it just doesn't fit. And so she was really talking about the context of trying to do person-centered care with all these documentation requirements, okay? So let me move through, and I'll move through this pretty quickly. I won't touch on every slide because I want to make sure that I can show you some actual samples as we go through, but the plan is only as good as the assessment that it's based on. So that's where we're going to start, and we're going to talk about person-centered assessment a bit, okay? So just reminders here, and this could be training unto itself, but sometimes we think about assessment as sort of a static one-time event, when really, think about when somebody comes in initially, they're not sharing their most intimate hopes and fears with you just because we got to get our assessment in the chart in 72 hours, right? So just as our relationship evolves over time, so too our assessments need to evolve over time. And they get used for all sorts of functions, of course, eligibility, extent of need, to recommend some services. But what I want to focus on today is it's also an opportunity to really evaluate somebody from a more person-centered, strengths-based perspective. So there are 4 key things that I just wanted to highlight, ways in which I think assessment can sometimes be lacking, that I really want you to think about highlighting, opportunities for highlighting. And those 4 things would be around the assessment and understanding of strengths and interests, cultural preference and treatment implications, stage of readiness, and then are we kind of weaving that all together with a truly person-centered understanding that goes beyond the data. And I'll say just a few words about each of these. Sometimes it's best said simply. It's about what's strong. It's not only about what's wrong, okay? And why do we focus on strengths? Because it promotes engagement. It communicates a message of hope to people. Where possible, I try to remind folks, if you can, it's important to specify what those strengths and interests are. With a lot of the electronic health records and even paper templates, there's this tendency to have these broad categories, like I see a checkbox on family support, or I see a checkbox on community interest. And that's great. It gives me an idea that a person has some strengths, but it's actually much more helpful for me to know that somebody lives with their mom and they share a devotion to their Catholic faith. So maybe they can work in the plan together on a goal of going back to church together on Sundays, okay? So some specification is particularly helpful. And here's just some tips, some of our favorite questions that we've found can really unlock some of those buried interests and sparks. Some of these actually come out of the good work of our peer specialists on some research projects we've done up here at Yale, where they've kind of taken the lead on some of this pre-planning strengths-based assessment. So sometimes it's about asking the question indirectly. Like, think about it. It's really hard, especially if you feel sort of either beaten down by years of struggles or maybe haven't always felt respected in the receipt of your care. It's hard after you've been reviewing all the lists of things that have gone wrong when somebody says to you, now tell me about what strengths and interests you have to draw on, okay? So not everybody can do this on their own. It requires some creative prompting. So just to point out a few of these, again, a link to a strengths-based assessment is included at the end in the references page, but to point out a few of my favorites, I love the one about what are you most proud of in your life? Or also, if you could plan the perfect day, what would it look like? What would you be doing? Who would you be spending your time with? Or use questions that are kind of sort of prompt the person to think back in time, maybe before the struggle started, like when you were a kid, what did you dream of being, okay? And of course, not neglecting key areas around faith and spirituality, choice making. What degree of choice do you have in your life? Are there choices that are made for you? Is getting more choice in your life back something you want to work on in your planning process? And my last thing that I will say, specific to this piece about strengths, is that you know, over time, I've seen people in the field do a really beautiful job of exploring strengths, discovering them, but then the biggest tragedy after you've invested that time is I don't see them actively being used in a concrete way in the recovery plan. And strengths were not meant to sit on a shelf. So I'm going to give you some examples of where you might pull them in, because you really want to capitalize on strengths in the plan. You know, there's a person who has a love of books. Maybe you can ask them to help out in the agency library. Somebody who's into music might find it to be a great soothing strategy to have access to headphones. Like, remember Mr. Gonzalez? Maybe he might benefit from some spiritual direction. So just trying to give you examples of some concrete ways you might pull it in, and then I'll show you where that might get reflected in a minute. But I am recognizing the time, and we are due for our 5-minute break. So I'm going to suggest we take that, and when we come back, we'll shift to this piece about culture.
Thank you, Janice. And we're going to go ahead and take our 5-minute break now, and we will reconvene at 12:40.
Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you, Janice. Janice, do you want, would it be worthwhile to go back to slide 24 just for you and I to test the sound again?
Sure, because we have one more video that we may have time to play at the end.
Okay, so let's just test that. I'm going to take control back for a moment and go back to, I'm just going to bring up that file again, and I'm going to mute my phone and see if that helps. Okay, I'm going to mute my phone now.
Okay. I'm personally not hearing anything, Leanne, through the phone line. I'm dialed in.
And I don't think you're necessarily meant to hear it through the phone. I think you're meant to hear it through the computer speakers.
But since I'm dialed in, if I have audio through both my phone, if I turn on the computer, then I'll get that's when the echo happens.
Oh, the echo would be from her.
I'm going to, Eric had a thought about that, Janice.
Yeah, so if you do hear it and you have your phone broadcasting the audio, it will rebroadcast that audio with a slight delay, which will cause the echo.
Okay. So I'm not going to worry about me hearing it on the line, but if folks are able to hear us, and I do see some folks in the chat box telling us that it's okay if they're listening through the computer. So muting your phone line and playing it, having folks listen through the computer does seem to work.
Good. All right. Well, that will be our plan for the next video when we're able to do that. Great. Thank you. Now take your break. Janice, I think we're ready to get started again. Welcome back, everyone.
Okay, great. I just want to point out, I skipped over just a couple of quick slides. We'll just point out to you, like as I did with some of the sample strengths-based questions, I did put in a couple of our favorite questions when we're really thinking about culturally sensitive assessment and things we might want to inquire about. But I wanted to start here because I think this slide in particular is most directly relevant to the topic around person-centered planning here, because I think it needs to be said, while many people require more control, autonomy, independent decision-making, they want to be in the driver's seat of their treatment, it's a big part of what is driving this push for person-centered. I think it needs to be said that those are not necessarily values that are valued across all cultures, and then within cultures, not across all individuals. So some individuals may prefer more kind of a collective decision-making process. And I think for me, one of the biggest points of learning in my career around this, a number of years ago, we had a large randomized research trial where we were implementing and evaluating a model of person-centered planning with African Americans and Latinos up here in Connecticut. And we were, had pulled into the research design peer specialists who were doing peer mentoring on person-centered planning. And those peers were available to both do strengths-based assessment, educate the person prior to their meeting, and to actually go to their treatment planning meeting with the individual as a supporter. Very cool project. But what was very fascinating, especially the Latinos, Latinas that were involved in that project, many of them, it felt pretty alien to them, this idea of being in the driver's seat. They had a tremendous amount of respect for authority and kind of trust in their primary clinical providers, and they felt it would almost be disrespectful to invite a third party into that relationship. And then other individuals would say things to us like, I don't really want to be in the driver's seat. Like, my aunt who raised me has always done right by me, and I trust her opinion, and I really prefer to defer to what she thinks would be best. So in the name of person-centered planning and empowerment, I'm not going to say, well, Aunt Janis, you know, you need to be quiet over there because Eric has to call his own shots. I'm going to, you know, again, I'm going to adapt the process so that it really is truly in keeping with that person's individual and cultural preferences. So please just know there's no hard, fast rules around this. I often say that the practice of person-centered planning, it's not about fidelity, it's about fiddling, right? I'm going to give you lots of representative strategies. I've been trying to do that, but what it looks like is going to vary significantly from individual to individual. So let me go on here to the next set of slides, and I apologize, it looks like I inadvertently jumped over a couple. So I'm going, this is my next slide here where I'm going to start, okay? So just want to say, I think there's absolutely value in assessing stage of change or stage of readiness, but there's value in that because it's an informed starting place for offering services that someone might be more responsive to. I'll say a bit about that in a minute. It is not meant to suggest that we're assessing readiness to determine eligibility or, sadly, ineligibility. It's not meant to screen people out of services. It's an opportunity to really program for success by kind of matching what the, oh, I need to get out of slide. I realized what I did here. Apologies, 1 second. I just need to get back in slideshow view. Leanne, can you just remind me, do I just, oh, there we go. Sorry, folks. Now the slides won't jump. So just a quick example of what that might look like. You know, if you have someone that, you know, comes into services and they're really struggling, they don't understand what's happening, maybe they tell you they don't have a problem, you know, the judge sent me here, my wife sent me here. It makes little sense in that case to kind of load up that person's recovery plan with a whole ton of services. Go here, go there, do this, you know, do that, relapse prevention. It makes much more sense to really think about practical help, outreach efforts, you know, crisis intervention, relationship building, peer support. If someone is homeless and living under a bridge, they're very unlikely to come in and regularly meet with your doc right away. Perhaps they don't trust the treatment system, but they will accept a sandwich and a warm blanket. So I know this is good work you're all intuitively doing already. I just wanted to kind of link it back to this idea of how we think about the role of assessing stage of change in recovery planning. It's an opportunity to really have a direct impact on the kinds of plans that you create. So finally, I will say last area that person-centered assessment is sometimes lacking is around this idea of an integrated understanding or a narrative summary. So let me just say a few words about what I mean about that and why it's important, and kind of give you some examples so that you can be thinking about it. So very often at the end of the assessment, right, the assessment is really all about kind of collecting the facts, the data, the what. But at the end of collecting all those facts and talking to the individual and reading the records, you have to weave it all together in a coherent whole that helps you really to understand the why. Like, how are you making sense of this data? So in that sense, the integrated summary should really not just be all cluttered up with a repetition of the data. It should have some hypotheses, some ideas for key themes and things of that nature. And then that should be shared back with the individual because it's an opportunity to build a healing partnership. So it might sound something like this. We've had an opportunity to meet several times now, and I know we've been going through a lot of questions based on what, you shared with me. This is what I think might be going on and what I think might be helpful. How does that sort of square with how you're seeing things? Because, again, this is an opportunity to kind of go beyond the data because it really can impact your plans for the better. So let me give you a classic example that I think illustrates this really well. I read hundreds of assessments, and in those assessments, I'll see 20 references to medication noncompliance, and that leads to rehospitalization, okay? Then at the end of the assessment, I get to the summary section. And in the summary section, what does it say? Very often it says, person has a long history of med noncompliance, and this leads to rehospitalization, okay? So there's a tendency in the summary to just repeat the data, repeat the facts. And what you have to do to get to a good person-centered plan is you have to answer the why question. And you have to have a deeper understanding of why a person might be making a choice not to use medications in their recovery. And the reason for that is that the answer to the why question is going to lead you in a very different direction in your planning documentation, and particularly in the ways that you might help the person. So if a person doesn't want to take them because there's really unbearable side effects, maybe they have sexual side effects and it's interfering with their intimate relationship. So then maybe you need to do some family-based interventions to help the family manage that, or maybe you need to consider alternative medications with different side effect profiles. Or maybe a person has religious objections to taking medications or cultural preferences to use alternative healing strategies. In that case, maybe you do some kind of outreach and collaboration to someone with their faith-based or their cultural community, okay, and get them involved in the conversation. Sometimes people are reluctant to take medications because they have to choose between the copay on their medication and breakfast on the table for their kids. So in that example, that might lead you down the trail to have an intervention that's more of a case management intervention or connecting them to different financial resources. So the answer to the why question is really critical because it's going to lead to a very different kind of plan. So just to summarize, 4 key ways that I would say person-centered assessment, think about highlighting, obviously, the role of strengths. Think about the role of stage of change and culture, and then be thinking about how you use that integrated summary as a way to go to a deeper person-centered understanding of an individual. I think I mentioned I just got back from working in the state of Texas, and they have a very vibrant person-centered planning initiative out there. They've been hard at work at it for years, and it's a classic example of this. Do we really understand the why question? Came out of one of the agencies we were supporting, where there was a young woman, teenager, who identified as Mexican-American. She is, I think, 15, increasingly experiencing depression, having some thoughts of suicide, had been hospitalized several times in the last year. And each time she would go into the hospital, they would put her on antidepressants, they would offer her CBT targeting depression, she'd get stabilized, released to the CMHC, and despite using those services and continuing to use her medications, she was ultimately landing up back in the hospital. And so the take-home message to this is on a deeper person-centered assessment and with a deeper person-centered integrated summary. What the young teenager ultimately revealed to her trusted clinician was that about a year ago, she had started questioning her sexuality. And she actually was in a romantic relationship with a female peer. And she came from a very traditional Mexican-American family, very conservative values based on their culture and their faith, very different levels of acculturation. And there were tremendous tensions in the home. And she felt when her parents became aware of this relationship that she had been shunned, she was forbidden to see her partner, she was being bullied at school, she was uncomfortable in her faith community. And so when they got to that deeper person-centered understanding in the assessment, you can imagine how that could change the plan in a really dramatic way. So maybe she needs some referral around LGBT-specific services or peer support. Maybe there need to be some family therapy or some outreach to her cultural or her faith community. So cognitive behavioral therapy and the medication may be one part of the puzzle, but I would argue if they had not discovered that in the person-centered assessment, she was likely not going to be able to move past that and move forward in her recovery. So just trying to give you, again, very concrete examples of why this method of documentation is important. So let me move on. I'm going to aim to end about 20 after 1 to take some questions. But big picture goal of transferring this information into the actual plan itself. I previewed this for you earlier with Mr. Gonzalez. Just note a couple of things up here that may be different. Some of you may already be documenting according to this flow. But I just want to point out traditional treatment plans start with and are driven by the problem list most often. Good person-centered plans, the goal statement as defined by the person in their own words, if possible. And then you want to have a balance of strengths they can draw upon, but there's going to be those barriers or those behavioral health needs that interfere. Those will get followed up with your rigorous short-term objectives. Someone was asking for tips on writing those. I'm going to give those to you in a minute. And then finally, notice at the bottom there that traditional treatment plans are often limited to traditional billable clinical rehabilitative services. And in a good person-centered plan, we're talking about rounding that out to really reflect both action steps taken by the person in recovery as well as actions by natural supporters. So a couple quick words on goals in the recovery vision. I've kind of touched on this again. We want to move past just clinically defined goals and really talk about building that recovery capital in the community. Because at the end of the day, what people really want out of life is the same thing that we all want out of life, whether we have a behavioral health diagnosis or not. We want to be a part of the life of the community. We want to have valued roles. We want to have intimate connections, whether it's to other human beings or to a higher power. We want to have work and, school and all those kinds of things. And the person-centered plan is an opportunity to have those things drive the plan by including them in the goal statement. So ideally, these are expressed in the person's own words. Not everyone can do that on their own. I've worked with plenty of people through the years who I would say were almost conditioned to say things like, I'm going to come in every week to see you. If a voice tells me to hurt myself, I'm going to go straight to the emergency room and let you know. Are we done with the plan? Can I sign it? And let's get a cup of coffee. And that, is really a sad reflection of that's how rote and defined that person's experience of treatment plan had been for many years, that's really all it had been about. When in reality, I think with the deepening of the relationship, there were many more things that he wanted in his recovery we could focus on. So it's okay to help people. It's okay to offer suggestions and say things like, you know, I notice you keep gravitating to the art group over at the clubhouse. Have you ever thought about taking a class at the local rec center? Or would you like to get, you know, a job stocking the shelves at the art store? So people sometimes say, oh, I don't want to put words in folks' mouths, but remember, it's a partnership. If folks are struggling on their own, I would say it's certainly okay, based on your person-centered understanding, to suggest some things. At the same time, your barriers do not get neglected in the person-centered recovery plan. Remember, this is all about balance, as I had said. So, you know, ask yourself the question, ask the person, why can't they achieve the goal tomorrow, and why can't they do it themselves? You know, what is getting in the way, right? And when you are documenting what is getting in the way, especially as it relates to things that might be associated with a behavioral health condition, I would say it's really important to be descriptive about that for a couple of different reasons. So what you see up here, in that barriers field or clinical needs field, I'll sometimes see anger issues, depressive symptoms, addiction. But without the descriptive detail, I don't really have a clear sense of what that looks like for each individual. So maybe instead you say things like the person's had some outbursts and conflicts with neighbors, or maybe they lack the energy to take care of basic household tasks, or frequent substance use at their apartment has led to police calls, or maybe they're at risk of getting evicted. Now, I would say that these would be particularly nicely documented barriers, especially if the person's most valued recovery goal on the plan is about, I want to get my own apartment and keep it. Because providing the descriptive detail on the barrier does two things that I think are important. It is important to justify the professional services you're providing and to bolster the medical necessity in your documentation. But I think more importantly, from a recovery perspective, when you document the barriers in this way, it connects the dots for the person back to what's most important to them and why they're working on all this stuff in the first place. So barriers do not get neglected, but we want to kind of keep talking about them insofar as how they get in the way of what's important to the person. So here's just another quick example. We would not want a goal of just reducing symptoms and increasing concentration, right? That's a little bit too narrow. Maybe that's something we target in an objective. I'll get there in a minute. But really, in her own words, something she wants to move toward, not just get away from. She says, I want to get my degree in education and someday be a teacher. But maybe she has difficulty concentrating due to depression, has had spotty attendance in the past at GED class due to lack of energy, high anxiety. Maybe she's having a tough time because of panic attacks, taking the bus to those GED classes. And then looking beyond sort of the individual experience of the behavioral health condition, there could be a whole range of external, systemic, or organizational barriers. Maybe they need to secure financial aid, they're having a hard time finding childcare so they can get to class, and so forth. So what I'm hoping you're going to see in this descriptive documentation of the barriers, you get crystal clear on what's getting in the way and how it's getting in the way, and that will actually pave the way to the next documentation element in the plan, right? Which is your objectives, your short-term objectives. So recovery can sometimes happen in small steps, you know, and objectives are a way of kind of taking what can feel like an overwhelming long-term journey and chunking it down into more manageable bite-sized chunks. So I like to think of objectives, for me, it's the analogy of my to-do list, right? I have a never-ending to-do list, and sometimes I'm really overwhelmed with everything that's on it, but that sense of accomplishment that I get when I sort of cross something off the list, you know, it gives me that sort of fuel I need to kind of keep going because I know I'm getting there, okay? So they're an opportunity to really sort of celebrate that progress. Another way to think of them, they're really the proof that the person is overcoming barriers and getting closer to those long-term goals. And in this sense, I think the short-term objectives on the plan send a really hopeful message that we believe that people, things can and will be different for the better, and soon. So let's talk about the soon and the time frame, because that's one of the elements of the technical criteria of well-written objectives. So many of you are probably familiar with this. There's a little bit of variation in the field for what each of these letters stand for, but the SMART criteria reflects the technical criteria of a well-written, concrete, measurable objective. So basically, if the SMART criteria doesn't work for you, I always say read the objective out loud and then ask yourself at the end of the time frame, the way that it's written, are we definitely going to be able to say, did they achieve it or did they not, without disagreeing amongst the team? Because if there's room for disagreement, chances are it was maybe a little bit too soft on the front end. So that's just kind of a nice litmus test to sort of check your SMART criteria. And so let me give you some more examples and tips on these, because universally people pretty much tell me, and it already came up in the chat box, that they're really the peskiest part of the plan to write, because on the one hand you want them to be meaningful, but at the same time you have to sort of hit all of these three technical criteria. So this is an example that comes out of a real person-centered plan that we had developed. A woman who was presenting for services. She was living with the experience of psychosis. She was having a particularly difficult time at one point in her recovery. And probably the most important part of her identity was her participation in her Baptist faith community. And so she was a respected elder in that community. She sang in the church choir. She taught Bible study. And then during a rough time in struggling with some of her symptoms and experiences, she started sort of in the middle of the aisle in a church services, speaking in a bizarre way that was increasingly alarming to other people. When folks tried to sort of help her and help her relax, things ultimately escalated, and in the witness of her fellow parishioners, she was, psychiatric emergency services were called, and she was forcibly removed from the church. So you can imagine this was incredibly traumatic. This is a huge part of her identity. Now, her traditional treatment plan could have said, maintain clinical stability after recent decompensation and med compliance, right? But that would have been sort of the old way of doing things. Here we talked about, I want to get back to being active at my church and teaching Bible study. And then she talked about anxiety, fear, distress. She was having an incredibly difficult time. Every time she tried to go back to church, she would get so stressed out, she'd get highly symptomatic. And she talked about being embarrassed, angry, distressed. So in order to help her overcome those documented barriers, we talked about helping her to better manage her anxiety that had sort of resulted by this pretty traumatic experience, as evidenced by her attending one service at her church within the next 60 days. And I think the way that it turned out in this case was that I think she actually, we modified the objective at the end of the time frame because she had, quote, not achieved it, but rather than looking at that as a failure, it was an opportunity to mix things up and say, what wasn't working about it? Was it too ambitious? Do you want to go to a different church? And it wasn't that. She wanted to get back to the church that she had been a long time member at, but we redesigned the objective so that she actually visited the church when it was empty, not during an actual service. So again, just giving you a sense of how these things change over time. And then a classic example in your objectives. We've talked about the SMART criteria. We've defined them. I've given you kind of a template for the flow of them. But here's probably my single biggest tip about objectives. You don't want to default to service participation when you write your objectives. If there's one place the quality of the plan goes awry in all the consultation I do, I would say that this is it. So sometimes people have a very person-centered understanding of someone, and they do a great job with a goal statement. Again, this one comes out of a real consultation, a woman that we'll call Wanda. She was a trauma survivor, and as a result of her trauma, she was really struggling with intense emotions, and through the years, the coping skill that she had come to rely on was cutting. She was engaging in some self-injury. And Wanda was married, and this put a tremendous amount of stress on her marriage, and at one point she was separated from her husband. And more than anything, she wanted to get back with her husband. And the team did a beautiful job of recognizing how important that was to her. Big goal on her plan: I want to repair my relationship with my husband. But then we dropped down to the objectives. And the short-term objectives on Wanda's plan said things like, Wanda will attend dialectical behavior therapy. Wanda will attend medication management meetings with the doc. Wanda will attend case management meetings. So all the objectives were about attendance, okay? So things like attending medication management, attending DBT, attending therapy, those are an important part of the plan, but they are not your short-term objectives. Those are your interventions, okay? And it's really important to ask the question when you write your objectives, as a result of attending dialectical behavior therapy, as a result of meeting with the doc and using meds effectively in her recovery, what concrete change in functioning or positive change in behavior do you hope that Wanda's going to enjoy, right? So you don't want to focus on the act of participating in services. You want to focus on what they get out of services, right? So in this case, maybe she's going to use mindfulness techniques to reduce instances of self-injury to no more than 1 per week for 2 consecutive weeks. This is a critical point. I would urge you all, review your documentation. If you see the words will attend, will attend, will attend in your objectives, very often we're slipping into this trap. The reason I highlight it is because, you know, I think it's a real tragedy. You could have people who are the most faithful attenders at services for years or even decades, but they may not be getting better as a result, okay? And, you know, really writing the objectives so it's about the outcome, the meaningful life outcome, it's an opportunity to check whether or not what we're doing is working. So you see this kind of classically in services. Another example might be somebody who wants to get their job back, but maybe substance use has been interfering with that in a whole bunch of ways. The objective is not attend with and comply with the IOP substance program, because I can guarantee you, you have people who, again, they're religious attenders, they're there every single day, but that doesn't mean that they don't get out of that group and then walk down the corner and score drugs or go into a bar because they're still struggling. You want to focus the objective on what's the meaningful change that they want out of their life. So it's a pretty easy thing to correct, and it responds well to feedback. So I just wanted to point it out because I think it's a nice kind of quality tip, if you will. So then another couple tips about objectives before I end on interventions. Try wherever you can to write behavioral objectives. We have this kind of classic example, I think, because they're pretty easy to write. Like maybe Amy's going to verbally identify 3 triggers to outburst at home with her kids, because maybe Amy's lost custody of her kids and she's working towards getting them back. That's an objective that's technically correct, and it's sometimes a place to start, but just keep in mind that people can learn and learn and learn until the cows come home. But until we apply that learning to change our behavior, none of us is able to move forward, okay? So maybe Amy's going to actually use some of those new, that new understanding, new skills, to have a minimum of 1 successful visit with her kids, as evidenced by the Department of Children and Family caseworker. So this is another example. Another way to think of it is that you want your objectives to be kind of just the right fit for someone. On the one hand, you want it to be something they cannot currently do, a bit of a challenge to stretch them, okay? But on the other hand, you know, you don't want the objective, you don't want it to be too easy, because when objectives are too easy, then they feel trivial to the individual. They don't feel meaningful. So I reviewed a plan recently where, you know, the person, they had quite a few significant difficulties currently in their recovery, but from an educational perspective and a cognitive perspective, the person had a master's degree in nursing, and the objective on the plan was something about verbally identifying 3 negative consequences of continued smoking. And so it shows kind of a mismatch between what really is the barrier there and what's going to be a meaningful objective to help the person move forward. And here's an example. Why do we assess stage of change? Why do we talk to the person about their readiness? It's partly because we want to have a stage-responsive recovery plan, including in our objectives. So if someone's earlier in their recovery, I'm not sure what models are most familiar in Florida. Maybe it's the Prochaska and D. Clemente. You might want to say more kind of like a motivational objective. Maybe they're just going to identify 2 negative effects that substance use has had on their recovery in the next 30 days. You're kind of trying to tip the scales in the favor of that change. But then maybe down the road, the person really recognizes the negative impact it's had. Maybe they're ready to commit to some change. Then maybe you start going for harm reduction around actually reducing use or even becoming substance-free. And then finally, a couple words about interventions before I close with a sample and take some questions. Finally, we get to the interventions. We're going to talk about the kinds of interventions in a well-rounded person-centered plan. Obviously, you want to be maximizing the use of evidence-based practices where they're available, where they're a good fit for the person, but still respecting individual choices and preferences. And writing your interventions in a certain way is another opportunity to support your medical necessity, okay? So let me tell you what I often coach to, which is sort of the critical W's of well-written interventions. You want to know who's providing the service, where possible by name or job title, recognizing that in some team-based formats it may not always be the same person, like assertive community treatment is a good example of that. But if you could specify the job title, that's helpful. The reason we talk about being specific, if you can, is that is sort of a measure of accountability. And the person knows who to go to with what, right? You know, what's the name of the service that you're providing? Is it cognitive behavioral therapy? Is it motivational interviewing, wellness recovery action planning, et cetera? And then when? Is it once a week for 30 days? Is it once a month, every 3 months? And then very importantly, the element that's most often left out is the why, which is the individualized intent and purpose, okay? So the reason the why is important, let's go back to this for a minute, it's especially critical for systems that I see doing a lot more group treatment. You really have to think about that because if you have 10 people in a group, they could be in there for all different reasons, and it's really important to individualize your intervention statement. So I often use the example of a social skills group. You're going to have some kind of social skills group. You could have 5 people who are in there learn how to speak up and be more assertive around their needs, and 5 people who are in there learn how to be quiet and maybe learn how to sort of take turns in conversation or communication, and they're really different needs. It doesn't have to be a lengthy book, but just a little phrase about sort of why are you providing that service. So let me just read one of these as an example to show you how it comes together. Holly Baker, addictions counselor, will provide motivational enhancement during weekly home visits over the next 90 days for the purpose of encouraging Oliver to refrain from using drugs or alcohol prior to visitation with his children. So you see, you know who, you know what, you know when, and you know why. And hypothetically speaking, this was probably linked to some kind of a goal around improving relationships with children, and maybe it had more of a harm reduction-oriented short-term objective around reducing use, or really thinking even just about, can we stop during the times that you know you're going to be seeing your kids? But do not forget to round out the person-centered plan. Professionals are only part of the equation. We want to have both self-directed actions as well as if someone invites, say, a family member into the process, try to specify rather than using kind of vague general statements. So instead of saying a natural supporter will provide encouragement. Well, let's say Wanda's living in the shelter and her mom has custody of her kids. Wanda's mom's going to call every Sunday night, so Wanda has an opportunity to speak with her mom and children. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you as I close here to think about what you might think about someone I'm going to call Greg. So get ready through your chat box because I'm going to invite some input here in a minute. Again, based on a real story of someone we supported a number of years ago, Greg was very lonely. He used to go to the jazz festivals. Now he feels like a zombie. He's not getting out of the group home to do much of anything other than to come to the center. He thought maybe that was due to his meds. Although he would like a girlfriend, he's really terrified to get back out there in the community. It's been 10 years since he dated anyone. He was someone who had been kind of in and out of a state hospital for a while. Doesn't know where to start. Very anxious around taking the bus, unable to take the bus, afraid to go anywhere alone, and would often get confused or fear that someone might try to hurt him. So based on that brief description of Greg, I would like to pull up a poll here that Leanne is going to help me with. I'm actually going to have you vote, if you don't mind. What do you think, based on our conversation today, that would be the best goal statement for Greg's PCRP? You see on the right, the 5 statements should have popped up. So you should have your dashboard open on the right, and it's going to give you an opportunity to vote. I'm going to give you about just a little under a minute to do that, maybe even shorter. And then we'll close the poll and take a look at the results. A few more seconds. All right, Leanne, can you go ahead and close the poll so I can see what folks think? Did you have some responses coming in?
Yes. And it's waiting for some participants to submit responses. So give us just like 3 more seconds.
Oh, sure, no problem.
Okay, I think we're all done.
All right, so we've got some folks, we've got kind of a mix of responses here. Some folks, maybe I don't want to feel like a zombie, I just want to be happy. Couple of things about those goal statements. They're in his own words, which is a step in the right direction. You could hear him saying something like that. 2 reasons why I think those would not be the most ideal response, okay? I don't want to feel like a zombie. Remember, that's focused on sort of that more narrow experience of sort of fatigue and lethargy, him feeling like a zombie. And we want to think broader life role goals when we think about the PCRP. And then with number 5, I just want to be happy. The issue with that one is that in the goal statement, you want to have a sense of the direction the plan is heading in. So there, the follow-up question you would want to ask, Greg, just using your interviewing skills is, so what would make you happy, right? And a number of you thought that if you asked him that question, he would tell you straight out, number 3. What would make him happy is I want a girlfriend, okay? So let me show you what a plan would look like, starting with a goal like that, because that was actually the one that we had the least number of folks respond around. And I think there's probably a bunch of reasons for that. I mean, I will tell you, years ago as a young clinical psychologist, I knew how to do a multi-axial diagnosis. I knew how to recognize symptoms and help people get rid of them. When I came out into community-based practice as a young psychologist, and people like Greg started saying to me, I want a girlfriend, at the time I couldn't even find my own husband, let alone figure out how I would help Greg get a girlfriend. So it challenged me to really rethink my role as a professional. And here's the kinds of things you can come up with. So if you start the goal with, I want a girlfriend, just someone to share my life with. People get very nervous and they say, we will never get paid for that. It won't need Medicaid, mental health, necessity. But remember, you don't get paid for the goal statement. You get paid for professional behavioral health services to document clear issues, concerns, impairments related to behavioral health conditions. And so you see here, we had balance in the strengths, but clearly documented behavioral health issues. He had intrusive thoughts or paranoia. He would actually call it that. In social situations, maybe some negative symptoms or side effects of meds that resulted in that severe fatigue. He could get easily confused or disorganized, like if he would get off the bus on the wrong stop, he would sometimes get lost and overwhelmed. And he would also openly acknowledge that he was really struggling at times with his personal appearance. So for those of you that are concerned about how do you write a quote-unquote professional clinical treatment plan in a way that honors the person without compromising the attention to the important issues, I'm trying to illustrate that here through the Greg example. One quick objective you might have, maybe he's going to use different kinds of coping skills to manage distressing symptoms to participate in a minimum of one preferred social activity each week for the next 90 days, preferably around some of those strengths he had identified that you all had uncovered in your person-centered assessment, okay? In a real plan for Greg, given his level of care and the things he was struggling with, he may also have had an objective around being able to successfully ride the bus. In fact, the story this evolved out of, he was interested in a counter clerk that had worked in the downtown Dunkin' Donuts. So maybe he needs an objective around using coping skills to ride the bus to be able to get downtown. Maybe when he gets downtown to the Dunkin' Donuts, he needs an objective around demonstrating some conversation starters so he can strike up a conversation with her. Or maybe he needs an objective around putting his best foot forward around his personal appearance and self-care so that he can make a good impression. So you can see how each of those objectives might document to a clearly identified behavioral health issue that was identified in the assessment. And then last but not least, before I open it up to questions, Greg might need a range of services that can help him to achieve that objective. All these interventions here illustrate kind of your key W's. Maybe he's going to benefit from some medication management, some in vivo coping skills training. There you see the travel training. In this case, it happened to be a peer specialist that was supporting him with that. You see in parentheses, I give a little bit of detail about the why. Remember the why of the intervention statement? And then last but not least, you round out the person-centered plan, both with involvement of his brother, Jim. He had a brother who was very supportive who agreed to go with him because remember, he didn't want to go alone. And then there was this ongoing question around what was going on with Greg in terms of that fatigue and lethargy, whether it was medication or it was negative symptoms. And so Greg got actively involved in this because he's a big part of it too. And he was keeping a basic log for the doctor about how he was feeling and his energy level while the doc worked on kind of evaluating and adjusting the meds. So all that to say, to end with the example, I'm hoping that I've illustrated that you can, in fact, write a plan that honors the person and still satisfies the chart. It can be linked to and flow from a nice person-centered assessment because it's really not a soft method of planning or of documentation. So at that point, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for the little bit of time left. We have some more questions. I've tried to respond to some when I can, but feel free to fire them into the chat box for us because I'd love to entertain some questions or ideas. Leanne, can you help me if you see any of them?
I do. Okay, so one has just come through.
Is there any book with samples of these kinds of plans? My publisher would kill me because I almost never mention it, but we did in fact write a book on this topic. It's in the references, and it does have lots of examples in it. Another one that I would point you in the direction of, a good friend and colleague of mine, Diane Greeter and Neil Adams, have written 2 excellent books on this topic that include some diverse examples. And again, please know in the references section, a lot of the tools that I've referenced today are actually included in there, and most of them are web-based.
Thank you, Janice. And are you responding to the question about are there any books with samples?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And did you see the question about the 28 residential recovery program?
No,
I don't know if that's,
I did not.
Okay, it says, I work in a 28, I don't know what that means, but I work in a 28 residential recovery program. Any tips toward making treatment goals for such a short time period?
Yeah, what I often say to people, if you're working in more of an acute setting or a short-term or a brief-term setting, the plans that I've shared with you today kind of show the richness of the plan, how it's developed over time, and many of those are relevant to more longer-term care. Again, they don't all need to look like this. I would actually have very different expectations for what a plan created in a 28-day program might look like, or a plan created in a 72-hour respite program. Because again, the plan is only as good as the relationship it's built on, and you may not have all the information there. So that may need to be more of kind of a temporary plan, if you will, for the chart. And we would expect that it would evolve over time. But having said that, I hope I've shared some tips today, because even plans that are more temporary plans based on what you know in the moment, there's lots of different ways in which you can enhance the person-centeredness of those. Whether it's
Janice, I was going to, are you ready for one more comment?
Yeah.
Okay, this comment relates to, I think, going back to the poll regarding Greg and his objective. And there was just a stated comment about a girlfriend being a rather narrow objective and maybe setting him up for rejection or disappointment.
Well, he wanted a girlfriend at the time that we developed that goal. Just in general, he wanted to get back out there and start dating. He hadn't identified and been sweet yet on the Dunkin' Donuts counter girl, but here's the thing about when you write the plan, okay? Even if the person doesn't achieve the specific goal that's on their plan, if you can encourage them, use that goal as motivation to get them back out there, to get Greg more effectively using services and supports, to get on the bus, to feel more comfortable going downtown. The reality is maybe he never gets that girlfriend, maybe it doesn't work out, but maybe he strikes up a conversation with somebody on the bus who invites him to go to church on Sunday, or who offers him a little part-time job. So I always kind of say, go with the motivation in the moment, and even if people don't achieve the goal, there's all sorts of great things they may discover along the way.
Thank you, Janis. I appreciate that. And if you're ready, I'm going to go ahead and start our concluding remarks. I think that's all the time we have for questions.
Sure, that's fine. Thanks for your time today. Again, I know we covered a lot of material. I was asked to cover an ambitious scope. I hope I at least did that and gave you practical tips, and please see the references and resources. Lots of goodies in there for you. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you, Janis. We appreciate it very much. I wanted to, of course, also thank all of the participants for attending today's webinar. Thank you very much. We always appreciate your attendance and certainly your very active participation when you have the opportunity to interact with a presenter like Dr. Tondora. That's just great. Do note a couple of items before we wrap it up. As I think many of you know, when you do exit our event and when I close out the webinar today, you should be directed to an evaluation form on the FATA website. But if you have difficulty or if the link doesn't work for you, not to worry. I will be sending out a follow-up thank you email in about 30 minutes to all of you. And that thank you email will also include a link to the evaluation. So you'll have another opportunity to give us your feedback on the webinar today. Do remember, if you want to get a certificate of attendance or for us to report to the state CE database, you will need to complete the evaluation. And of course, do remember that the certificate of attendance will be delivered to your email address within 5 business days. So in closing, again, thank you, Dr. Tondora, thank you, participants. And of course, we want to thank the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's webinar. So everyone have a great Friday, and please hold for the evaluation.